Hello, my name is Greg McKay. I'm Chair of the Australian SRV Association, ASRVA. Each year we hold a series of 4 conversations. The purpose of the conversation series is to show SRV ideas meeting everyday challenges and opportunities. This video is of one of those conversations. It's presented by Fiona McGill and is entitled My Friend Mary, A Great Life, A Good Death. Fiona is a long-time supporter of SRV. However, the reasons we've invited her to tell the story of Mary is that it is a very personal, real story, a poignant story. It shows the value of SRV and, importantly, it shows how essential it is to stand by vulnerable people, something Professor Wolfensberger exhorts us to do given the impacts of social devaluation. In this presentation, there are moments of rejoicing about Mary's qualities and her roles. There are also moments of angst and deep sadness. Listen out for what we can learn about the devaluation of older people and the wounding inflicted by systems, even though the people involved are probably well-intentioned. Listen out also for the impacts on Mary.
Thanks, Greg. Just a short introduction to me. I worked for many years with people with disabilities and complex needs in a very small disability service in Sydney. And that's when I first got involved with SRV. When I stopped working there, I taught at TAFE and at the Australian Catholic Uni. And then moving to Queensland, I've done a lot of consulting work and training in Queensland, a lot of supporting families. And I'm sort of retired now, but every now and then I do something for Parramatta Council, some of whom are here. Okay. Right, I'm going to open the PowerPoint that I have today. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to see that properly. Okay, so this is a story about my friend Mary. Mary died peacefully in hospital with her sister and her niece by her side. She'd been there for several weeks while they tried to treat her breaking heart. Mary had called me one evening to say she thought she needed to go to hospital. Are you sure, Mary? I said, you know what it's like there? Yes, she said, I'm in pain. And I hurried round to her house with power of attorney documents. She was in severe pain. We jumped in her car because she had a thing about that we should always drive her car so as not to inconvenience me, or something about paying her own way by, taking her car. And we rushed to Caboolture Hospital. The emergency department nurse the triage nurse was really good. And she hurried us in and took all the power of attorney documents to photocopy. And the emergency doctor was really great as well. He did his examination really thoroughly. And he asked Mary lots of questions respectfully and with interest in her answers. I don't want to die, she said. I think I've got a bit more living in me yet. Mary was my good friend. She rented a little beachside cottage and she loved her garden. She loved trees, especially the old man Banksias that were across the road in the park. She loved the birds and she fed the butcher birds every day, and they used to fly into the house if she was late with the breakfast. She loved the sea and the sky, and she started the Moonwatch group called the Lunatics. She was the contact person for everyone in her large family and the family helper. And if anyone needed medical support or advice or just somebody to talk to. She'd taken up the violin in middle age, and she also painted. She was also a member of our environment group. And I remember once when we went to help the turtle monitor with a turtle nest that was hatching. Mary and I couldn't resist helping the little turtles and carrying them down the beach as they flapped and struggled to get to the sea. I told the emergency department that I had power of attorney for medical matters. And when I returned the next day, they'd put her in the ward. They determined that her pain was an ulcerated aorta, which I'd never heard of such a thing before. The aorta, you may know, is the main artery from the heart. She had fairly good pain relief and she was feeling a little bit better. But the nurses had called her nephew instead of me. And the dietitian had been hassling Mary about filling in the meal request forms. I reiterated with the nursing staff that I had power of attorney for medical matters and would be responsible for contacting the family at Mary's request. I also asked to speak to the dietitian about Mary's food needs. Mary had complex food allergies and intolerances. She was tiny, so tiny and thin, and she had carbohydrate and FODMAP problems, amine allergies, and dairy and wheat intolerance. And she'd been struggling with these kind of problems all her life. She was very careful about her diet, made her own bread and shopped at the local Whole Foods store and prepared nutritious meals for herself. But the dietitian accused her of being resistant and fussy and demanded that she eat the yogurt and wheat bix and milky tea that they'd given her for breakfast. Because professionals always know better than old women. One morning, Mary had come to my place, as she often did, to chat about the various issues of the day. And we were talking about her difficulty with doctors not listening to her and not paying attention to her concerns. Oh, that's such a problem, I said. I see it all the time with people who the doctors assume are not as important as them. You're socially devalued, Mary. They think, oh, you're just a silly old woman. Your health doesn't really matter because you're going to die anyway. And what would you know? I'm a doctor. I know better, I chanted. I'll come with you to see the doctor if you want, I suggested. Mary pounced on my offer. Would you do that? Sure, I said, no problem. It's important to note here that this is not a story about me being a hero, because helping Mary with those medical visits was not a difficult thing for me to do. I was used to that in my work, and I think I have better than average medical knowledge, so this was not going to be a hard thing for me to do for her. So we embarked on this round of doctor's visits, starting off with the GP for referrals. The neurologist to investigate the funny pain in the back of her head, normal pressure hydroencephaly, they called it. Repeat visits to the eye doctor, macular degeneration injections. And Mary would say to him each time, I don't want to lose my sight. Mary loved to read. She had a fabulous book collection. The GP, though, the first time we saw the GP, he straightened suddenly in his chair as I followed Mary into the room. This is my power of attorney for medical matters, she announced. He was visibly stunned, and his demeanour changed markedly from his usual lackadaisical, literally laid-back approach. He actually paid attention to the questions that we had written out together and prepared referrals as I directed him for investigations that we were requesting. I would have to say, after several visits to him, he was the laziest doctor I have ever met in my life. Mary had already been told that she had arteriosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries. Her blood pressure was insane and impossible to treat, sometimes really high, sometimes dropping really low. They said that accounted for the pain in the back of the head. She walked regularly to keep the blood flowing, but to see her trotting up the street every morning to buy the newspaper, you would never have thought that she was in her 80s. Mary had asked me to be power of attorney for medical matters because despite her strong connection with her family, her large family, she didn't feel like she could really trust them. Her mother had kept her at home as the designated daughter companion. When Mary had tried to rebel and leave, her mother had had her committed to a psychiatric institution, as relatives could do in Australia up until the late 1960s. Mary escaped and fled to New South Wales, and the mentally ill label had dogged her for many years. She was the black sheep of the family, the spinster aunt, the enviro nutter. And she struggled with the negative assumptions of her brothers and sisters. The devalued status of mentally ill was now being compounded by old woman. Mary told us that she had never, ever in her life had a birthday party. So we organised a surprise party for her. In the hospital, I asked if she wanted me to contact everyone, and she said yes. So I called all the relatives and friends. Relatives came from Melbourne, Rockhampton, Bundaberg, Brisbane, and London. We set up a schedule as she was getting tired with everybody coming in all at once. But she was getting worse. She developed a cough, and they said she had a form of TB. They tried to treat the blood pressure, and it just became incredibly erratic. They put her in the intensive care ward, and we could only go in one at a time, and we had to wear full face masks. There were lots of machines burring and whirring and binging. I kept checking if she still wanted the treatments, and she was ambivalent, but she was certain that she didn't want to die. I asked the visiting medical officer who was in charge of her case if it would be good for her to see a gerontologist. Gerontologists usually are good with older people who have complex medical issues. He was visibly offended. I can deal with all these issues, he said. Mary's friend, who was an acupuncturist, got a worse reception. He was outraged that she was there and hinted at quackery. She argued back that she was a friend and had come to offer massage and knew better than to give acupuncture in a hospital. Because the hospital is an institution all of its own. There is nothing quite the same. It has rules and procedures that you mustn't contravene. The trouble is, of course, that the patients and the visitors don't know what those rules are, and only the professionals know them. And so the patient is often in a really powerless situation. 4 times I had to tell the nurses and doctors that I had power of attorney and that they were to contact me first. And 4 times they contacted various relatives, friends, and associates with information about Mary that she didn't necessarily want shared. They continued with the intensive invasive treatment, and Mary continued to be ambivalent and to look and sound more ill. I had to travel interstate for work. And finally, then the nursing staff got it that they had to call me first with any issues. Mary asked them to call me in Sydney, but I could barely hear her. She was so faint and breathless. They were proposing to move her to another hospital to operate on her aorta. That's open heart surgery on an 82-year-old with out of control blood pressure. I asked to speak to the VMO. He agreed that it probably wasn't the best idea and that she'd probably die on the operating table. And Mary told me that he'd come to her late one afternoon and badgered her to make a decision about the surgery, and she was flustered. She didn't want to die, but she wasn't sure if it was a good idea to have surgery. And so we decided to say no. Then North Brisbane flooded. I was trapped at the airport. The hospital was surrounded by a moat, and I had to get back to Mary to find out what was going on before things got out of control. And I worried that if only we could trust the medical profession to do what was in the person's best interest, not just apply the technology because it's there. By the time I could get into the hospital, they decided that all the treatments weren't working. I told you my blood pressure was untreatable, Mary reminded them. Yes, he admitted, which I think was a big admission for him. We're probably killing you with the treatment. These are not bad people. They are trying to do their jobs, but sometimes professionalism gets in the way of humanity. Mary decided then that she wanted to go home. So we started making up a list of supports she'd need and who could help. We asked to see the social worker. They moved Mary back into the ward, and the resident came to tell us the prognosis. The TB was a form known in birds. Mary's sisters and I darted looks at each other. Could that be from butcher birds? We asked the doctor. He wasn't sure. He told us the aorta was untreatable and that the weak spot would burst, maybe any day. It was just a matter of time. I gathered the family around to tell them. The niece from London was inconsolable, and the sister from Melbourne was distraught. Mary asked me to organise for people to be there all the time. She had been waking at 3 a.m, scared and alone, but waiting until a decent hour to ask the nurses to call me and ask me to come over. I was kind of surprised with myself that I hadn't noticed this. I hadn't realised this, that she was scared, that she was distressed. So I contacted everyone immediately and organised a roster for people to sit with her day and night. The hospital, I must say, were very good about this, and they allowed us to do it. One morning, Mary was dozing as a young enrolled nurse came in to make the bed around her. She was really careful and polite. Oh, she's so lovely, isn't she? She said, so cute and sweet. Mary was a nurse, you know, I said. Neurology special. Mary had been the nurse helper to all her family over the years and had a long career in various aspects of nursing. She was, in fact, the first neurology special in Queensland when the first neurology department was set up at the Mater in 1954. The young girl was so excited, not just a cute old granny, but in fact a woman with skills and talents and a history of work just like hers. Later I heard her telling other young nurses about the amazing old lady in room 2 who'd been a neurology special. We make assumptions about people. You shouldn't judge a book by its cover or a old woman by her wrinkles. The doctor told Mary what was likely to happen to her. And the social worker finally turned up to check if she had funeral arrangements. I'd be a hypocrite if I had a church funeral now, she told me. I rejected the church a long time ago. Her big brother was really disappointed when I told him her decision. But the next day she whispered to me, they've all rallied so amazingly. I've decided to let them have the funeral they want to have. Mel was relieved and immediately called an old family friend who was a priest. The next day was Mary's 83rd birthday and Moonwatch night. We filled her cubicle with balloons and champagne and Skyped the Moonwatch gang so she could see her last full moon. She died peacefully the next evening with her niece and sister by her side. Mel organised a great funeral. About 200 people came. It was full of Mary's favourite violin music, lovely photos of her and her friends. A fitting tribute to her radical, rebellious heart and gentle nature. It was officiated by a sensitive and thoughtful priest who Mary had had difficult religious discussions with when she'd abandoned the church. Her family were amazed at the number of people who came and realised somewhat late the life that she'd enjoyed on Bribie Island amongst people who saw her as an individual and appreciated her for who she was. I asked Mary's sister why Mary had never married. She felt unworthy, she told me, like no one would want her. How wrong she was. We scattered her ashes in the park under an old man Banksia and put a little plaque there commemorating the head lunatic. Not an insult, but a term of endearment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. It's still a hard story for you to tell. You had some rolls up on that last screen.
Mm.
Is it possible just to put those back for a minute?
Yes.
We know that SOV teaches us that roles, and especially roles where well ensconced in and roles related not just to function but to relationships, all help us feel like we belong, help us participate and protect us. And that's a great list you've got there that Mary inhabited. Yet deep inside she still didn't feel worthy.
Mm.
I just, hi, Fiona Campbell. I just, as you were telling that story and I was just writing down those positive roles, and there were so many that were, you know, it's just, it's wonderful. And I noted things like cook and tenant and driver and moon watcher, astronomer. Very big life. Thank you for sharing that.
Hirosha here, Fiona. Thanks for sharing your story. What really caught my sort of, I guess, heart is even with a fierce and great advocate and a friend like you beside her, she still had a lot of struggles to deal with in the hospital system. So it sort of gave me this idea that what about the people who don't have anyone at all? So while it's a very inspiring story that she got her, you know, her family rallied around her with a great friend like you, it's very hard to hear stories like this, because it sort of alerts you to what's out there, and it could be any one of us. So yeah, thank you for sharing the story.
I think that's a very good observation. I've often thought that during my work as well, you know, for people that we provided services to, if we weren't there, what would be happening to them? Because it was hard enough for, you know, professionals to be advocating for people. And I was just thinking today as well, there are so many things I could have done better with Mary, but you don't get another chance.
Oh, Fiona, in hindsight, we all could do better with a lot of the things in our lives. But I think the fundamental, most important thing you did was to be a genuine friend to her. And I don't think you, did a bad job of that at all. I think you were a wonderful friend to her. And, it goes to show with her funeral and the way that people rallied around her in the end, how much of a great friend you were to her. So yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'll just say one thing, Fiona. I think the having a friend to point out your valued roles when maybe they're a little bit hidden is what sort of changed everyone's image of Mary. Otherwise, she was just cast into those negative roles, you know, and everyone was quick to jump on those and assume that that's her identity. But having friends that can remind people of those positive roles, those valued roles, it changes the whole. The story about the young nurse is great. The young nurse starts telling other people about the roles. That's where it all happens, isn't it? It sort of generates its own momentum, you know, saves the person's dignity and identity. So that was a great thing that stood out for me.
Thank you so much. Sorry, thank you so much for sharing Mary's story with us, Fiona. I can see that there's a lot of emotion there for you, and it just shows how special she was to you. And I think she showed you how important her friendship was with you by wanting you to be there and allowing you to be so involved with her life and sharing her story and life with you. And there was lots of great examples of where you wanted to empower her to have a voice in a system where your voice can be lost. And I think also having that balance of the family being involved was really beautiful as well. And just having you as that person that was there to empower her and make decisions around her health. Yeah, because sometimes I think that can be confusing for people, and there's lots of people trying to make decisions around them and they don't know who to trust and who's the best person to help with that. So it's great that Mary was able to identify that you were that person for her. So thanks so much for sharing.
Thank you.